probably start upsetting people now, but sure. So there is a narrative, and it's important to say I could give examples of this for almost every narrative, and I am quite happy to do that. So if I'm upsetting anyone, I hopefully should be upsetting everyone kind of in an equal distribution that is doing what I think is some degree of disingenuous narrative confirmation. So let's look at the worldview that I would call kind of naive techno-optimism or techno-capital optimism. And we can see, Gates, Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling, like there's a whole kind of underlying thinking. And so when you see statistics quoted by Hans or John Mackey or whatever that say the world is doing better than it's ever been because in 1850 X percent of people lived on less than $1.50 a day, and now only this tiny percent live on less than $1.50 a day, therefore abundance is going up, and that makes a better quality of life for everyone. Well, that might actually be a true statistic, that it went from 60 people to 18% of people or something. I forget what the exact statistic is. That might be a true statistic, but that is misrepresentative in some really important ways, taken out of context, that in 1850 people's lives were mediated largely not by dollars. A lot of those people who they were talking about lived in log cabins that they made themselves, not mediated by dollars, and grew their own food. And so the idea that dollars mediated their life actually is not a good representation of economic quality of life, nor is the fact that now obesity, which is mediated by more dollars, is a radical cause of life expectancy challenges and all kinds of psychological and physical issues, and is kind of rampant and ubiquitous. And, when the story comes that the world has always had violence and we're less violent now, well, kind of, like we're in a fairly short period of having to be less violent of certain kinds after developing the bomb, but now the Bretton Woods Convention that mediated that has almost completely broken down. We no longer have tension between two nuclear-equipped superpowers, but a multipolar situation where a forced Nash equilibrium like mutually assured destruction isn't even possible. The tensions in the situation are heating, and yeah, we never had weaponized AI drones before, right? We didn't have CRISPR-based bioweapons. So, the fact that there might be less violence of some kinds at the moment, but radically more violence capacity and less ability to do anything effective towards it while orienting more towards it, is a stat that's not being, it's not a stat. You can't even make a proper stat on it. It's a trend line that isn't being paid attention to, nor is the radical amount of species extinction or coral bleaching or microplastics in the ocean or rampant addiction rates or etc. So I can take a true statistic out of context of all the things to assess and say quality of life is getting better. I can take another true statistic and say quality of life is getting worse. I can group some group of those statistics together to make a compelling argument with a book on either side, and neither of them are representative of the whole picture. And so something can be true in isolation, but it is way too reductive, and as a result is, if shared as representative and isn't, is actually a weapon to convince a narrative that is not actually a reasonable narrative. And so this is where I would say, like when we look at climate change, we have kind of like a Greta versus Trump narrative warfare on climate change, right? And people see letters circulating on Facebook, depending upon which side they're on, that say X percentage of scientists all agree that climate change is real and blah, 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 and the only ones who think otherwise are paid by oil companies. And then also X number of thousand of scientists say that the IPCC climate change thing is bunk and there's other stuff that we need to look at. And who actually looks at the science in detail themselves, looks at the methodology, looks at the models, looks at where the funding came from and the sources of bias, to actually be able to sense make themselves? They just defect to the authority that is most associated with their in-group. And the whole thing then ends up being oriented around CO2. And either CO2 is really a problem or CO2 isn't a problem. And that framing isn't even the right conversation. Because we look at, okay, what are the arguments for CO2 as a problem? Well, there's arguments about a lot of things, but let's just take, for instance, coral. Well, it's going to kill the coral and that's going to kill the oceans. Well, carbonic acid can affect coral. That's true. And increased temperature can affect coral. That's true. But that doesn't address nitrogen runoff from, radical amounts of NPK or other nitrogen-based fertilizer, creating nitrogen effluent that causes both dead zones in the oceans and messes up the phosphorus cycle for the coral, or having overfished most of the large fish species in the whale that create the trophic cascades from the apex predators that are actually necessary to maintain the coral. So again, it's like, even if there are some stats about CO2 that are true, they might not be representative of what we're claiming they're representative of, that it's actually a multifactorial situation. And to try and get something through, we think we have to orient it in this particular way and overhype that particular thing. Now, of course, I can actually use nitrogen fertilizer to grow more plants that sequester CO2 that will actually increase the rate of nitrogen runoff. And even though I'm sequestering CO2, I might be killing coral faster. And so this is an example where it's like, no, better sense making actually has to happen. And even facts, lots of times the facts are distorted, like it's just bullshit science, right? But sometimes the facts aren't distorted. The fact is true, but is one out of lots of metrics that matter, or taken out of appropriate context, where it is so not representative that the solution that is recommended is totally an appropriate solution.